The restaurant was alive with sound, the clatter of cutlery against plates mixing with the hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter rolling across polished wood tables. Jasmine moved through it all with a kind of practiced grace, weaving between chairs and balancing trays with an ease that came from years of repetition. Her uniform fit neatly, though she had ironed it herself at home that morning, the collar pressed sharp, her shoes polished though the leather had long since dulled with use. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who refused to let the world see how tired she was, how much of her energy was spent on surviving each day, shift after shift. It was a Friday night, the busiest time of the week, and the dining room was packed. Couples leaned close over candlelit tables, businessmen lingered over expensive wines, and families celebrated milestones with sizzling platters of steak and seafood. For Jasmine, it was another long evening, her smile worn but steady, her patience tested with each new order that came in. She had learned long ago that no matter how hard things got, she had to keep moving forward. Tips paid rent. Tips kept the lights on. And tips came easier when you swallowed your pride, even when someone treated you like less than human. But tonight something about the air felt different. Maybe it was the storm clouds rolling outside, flashes of distant lightning against the darkened sky. Maybe it was the table at the center of the room where a young man lounged as though he owned the place, his arrogance radiating like heat from a flame. His suit was too fine for his age, his watch gleamed with diamonds that caught the chandeliers overhead, and every laugh from his lips was just a little too loud, demanding attention. Brandon Carlyle. The name was whispered often enough in the city to carry weight. The Carlyle family was old money, but more importantly big money. His father owned businesses that stretched from real estate to media, from shipping lines to technology firms. Their fortune could crush small competitors with ease, and their influence reached so far that politicians smiled nervously when they walked into a room. Brandon was the heir to it all, and he knew it. He wore that entitlement like a crown, invisible but heavy enough to demand deference from anyone who crossed his path. Jasmine didn't flinch when she approached his table, though she could feel the tension ripple through the other servers. She had noticed them casting wary glances at him, whispering behind the counter. He had already sent one drink back, claiming it wasn't cold enough, and another plate, saying it wasn't cooked the way he wanted. His friends, a small entourage of men just as smug as he was, laughed at every cruel comment he made. They didn't laugh out of amusement but obligation, the way shadows bend toward the brightest flame even when it scorches them. "Your drink, sir," Jasmine said, placing the glass on the table, her voice steady, her tone professional. Brandon leaned forward, his gaze trailing over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well, finally," he drawled, picking up the glass as though it had taken an eternity to arrive. Then he smirked, his lips curling in mock charm. "You know, you're quick for someone in your line of work. Shame all that energy's wasted bringing people like me drinks instead of putting it to better use." His words carried, sharper than the clinking glasses, and the men around him chuckled. A few nearby tables fell silent, the sound cutting through the air like glass underfoot. Jasmine felt the familiar burn in her chest, the one that came every time someone thought they could reduce her to an object with a casual comment. She kept her expression neutral, her hands still at her sides. "Sir," she replied, keeping her tone even, "I'll treat you with respect if you'll do the same for me." The smirk on his face widened. He leaned back in his chair, stretching lazily, his expensive cologne drifting across the space between them. "Respect? Honey, do you know who I am? I could buy this place by tomorrow morning. You'd be begging to keep your job." His words drew another ripple through the crowd. Some guests lowered their eyes, others pretended not to listen, but everyone was paying attention. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let him see her falter. She had faced worse before. Customers who barked orders like she was invisible, men who tried to slip notes into her apron, people who believed their money gave them permission to be cruel. She had survived all of it. And then Brandon did something that shifted the entire atmosphere. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and with a casual flick of his wrist, tossed it onto the floor at her feet. The sound was small, a soft flutter of paper against tile, but it might as well have been a gunshot. Every conversation in the restaurant stopped. Forks hovered midair. The $100 bill sat there like an open wound between them, its edges trembling in the faint breeze from the ceiling fan. "Pick it up," Brandon said, his eyes locked on hers, daring her to kneel. "Show me how grateful you are." The hush that fell over the dining room was suffocating. Dozens of pairs of eyes fixed on Jasmine, waiting to see what she would do. Her breath caught in her throat, the humiliation pressed heavy against her ribs. She could almost hear the voices of every waitress before her who had been forced to swallow their pride, to bend, to smile, to keep the customer happy no matter the cost. For a moment, she considered walking away. Just leaving the bill where it was, pretending it hadn't happened. But something inside her rebelled. She thought of her mother, who had worked 2 jobs her whole life and never once allowed anyone to demean her spirit. She thought of her younger self, promising she would always stand tall, no matter how the world tried to push her down. Slowly, Jasmine bent, but not to kneel. Her fingers curled around the bill, crushing it into her palm. She straightened, her spine rigid, her gaze steady as she placed the crumpled note back on his table with deliberate force. "This restaurant doesn't tolerate harassment," she said, her voice low but clear enough to carry through the silence. "You're leaving. Now." The reaction was immediate. Gasps broke out across the room, whispers rose in waves. Brandon's smirk faltered, his face twitching with disbelief. He had never been told no, not once, not like this. "You can't be serious," he spat, his voice losing its lazy charm. Jasmine didn't flinch. "Dead serious. Out." For the first time that night, Brandon had no clever reply. His friends stared at him, waiting for him to laugh it off, to make a joke, to turn the moment into another one of his games. But he stood frozen, the entire restaurant bearing witness to the fact that his power meant nothing in front of her resolve. The $100 bill lay on the table between them, no longer a symbol of wealth or arrogance but of his humiliation. The room held its breath, waiting to see what he would do. And Jasmine stood tall, unshaken, as the balance of power shifted. Brandon's chair scraped back with a violent screech that made half the diners flinch. He pushed away from the table so fast his drink nearly toppled, his friends scrambling awkwardly as they rose with him, unsure whether to follow or stay seated. His face was flushed, blotched red with anger and humiliation, his jaw clenching so tight the muscles in his cheek twitched. He jabbed a finger at Jasmine, his voice slicing through the tense air like a blade. "You think you're brave?" he hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're nothing. Just a waitress, some nobody scraping by on tips. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll make sure you regret this. You'll be unemployed by morning begging for scraps." His words hit like venom, the kind meant to reduce someone to silence. But Jasmine stood rooted to the floor, her chin raised, her expression unyielding. She had dealt with threats before, landlords, bosses, customers who believed cruelty was a form of power. She wasn't going to bend to him, not tonight, not in front of all these people who were watching. "Threaten me all you want," she replied, her voice steady though her pulse pounded in her throat. "But you're leaving. Now." The silence stretched, brittle and suffocating. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their gazes darting between Brandon's towering frame and Jasmine's resolute figure. The tension was almost unbearable, as though the entire restaurant was holding its breath. Brandon's smirk twisted into a snarl. He slammed his palm down on the table, rattling the silverware, making his friends jump. "You'll regret this, girl," he spat, his words thick with disdain. Then, with a dramatic sweep, he shoved his chair aside and stormed toward the exit, his polished shoes striking hard against the tile floor. His entourage followed, scrambling after him like nervous dogs chasing their master, their laughter forced, brittle, and uncertain. The glass doors slammed shut behind them with a crack that seemed to reverberate through every wall. For a long moment, no one moved. The restaurant had gone deathly silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant rumble of thunder outside. Every eye was still fixed on Jasmine. She swallowed, the adrenaline still rushing in her veins, her hands trembling slightly though she refused to let it show. She glanced at the manager, who stood frozen near the kitchen, his mouth slightly open, his face pale. Finally, he rushed forward, lowering his voice though it carried enough to be heard by the nearby tables. "Jasmine, do you know what you've just done?" he whispered harshly. His eyes darted toward the door as though Brandon might burst back in at any moment. That was Brandon Carlyle. Carlyle, as in Carlyle Industries. His father owns half this city. He owns properties, hotels, even this building we're standing in. Jasmine tightened her jaw. "I don't care if his father owns the moon," she said firmly, though her heart still raced. "He doesn't get to treat me like that. Not here. Not ever." The manager groaned, dragging a hand down his face. "You don't understand. People like him, they don't forget. He'll come after you, and me, and this whole place. We can't afford to make enemies like that." His voice cracked with genuine fear. "You've put us all in danger." But before Jasmine could respond, a voice from a nearby table rose above the whispers. She was right. It was a middle-aged woman with short hair, sitting with her husband. She spoke clearly, her gaze steady. "No one should have to put up with that kind of behavior. Money doesn't give him the right to humiliate her." Others chimed in, murmurs rippling across the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others glanced nervously at the door, torn between admiration and fear of retaliation. Jasmine felt the tension in her chest ease, just slightly. People had seen what happened. They had witnessed her stand her ground. But she knew words of support from strangers wouldn't shield her from the consequences Brandon had promised. A group of young diners at the far table raised their phones, screens glowing as they whispered excitedly. They had recorded the confrontation. Clips of Brandon tossing the $100 bill, of Jasmine refusing to bend, were already spreading. The world outside this restaurant would soon see the exchange, and that reality made the manager even more frantic. "Put those away!" he barked at them, but they only smirked, their fingers flying across their screens as the videos uploaded. Jasmine turned away, refusing to let panic overtake her. She busied herself clearing plates from a nearby table, her movements sharp, precise, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. She felt humiliated, exposed, but also strangely empowered. For once, she had not swallowed her pride. For once, she had not let money dictate her worth. Minutes dragged like hours, the weight of the confrontation still pressing over the room. Slowly, conversations resumed, though quieter, more subdued. People leaned close, whispering, casting furtive glances at Jasmine as though she had become a living symbol of defiance. And then the ground began to tremble. At first, Jasmine thought it was her imagination, her nerves still rattled from the confrontation. But then the glasses on the tables rattled. Silverware quivered. A low, thunderous roar filled the air, louder than the storm outside. Guests looked around, alarmed. Someone gasped, pointing toward the wide front windows. Floodlights swept across the parking lot, blindingly bright, cutting through the dark like search beams. The rumble grew louder, rhythmic, mechanical, like the beating wings of some colossal beast. A helicopter descended from the night sky, its blades chopping the air with deafening force. The downdraft whipped up dust and loose papers, making the trees outside sway violently. Diners rushed to the windows, pressing their faces against the glass to see. The machine was sleek black, its sides polished to a mirror shine, the Carlyle insignia emblazoned on its tail. It landed in the center of the lot with military precision, its skids slamming onto the asphalt. The noise was overwhelming, the entire building vibrating with the force. The restaurant doors burst open as security guards in black suits entered first, scanning the room with earpieces pressed to their heads. And then, as the rotor slowed to a steady roar, a tall figure stepped onto the pavement outside, framed by the harsh white glow of the helicopter's floodlights. Richard Carlyle. He was instantly recognizable. His face was on magazine covers, business reports, news interviews. Silver hair combed neatly back, his tailored suit cut perfectly to his frame, every detail of his appearance radiating power and wealth. His stride was purposeful, commanding, as he entered the restaurant without hesitation. The room fell silent once more suffocating than before. No one dared to move. Even the manager, who had been fidgeting anxiously moments earlier, froze like a deer caught in headlights. Richard's gaze swept the dining room, cold and calculating, before landing squarely on Jasmine. "You," he said, his voice sharp as steel, carrying easily over the hush. "Are you the one who threw my son out of here?" The words hung heavy in the air, and Jasmine felt every set of eyes in the room turn toward her. Her chest tightened, her breath caught, but she forced herself to meet his stare. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling inside her. "I did." The restaurant's air was thick, almost suffocating, as Richard Carlyle stood at the threshold, his presence eclipsing everything else. The whir of the helicopter blades outside still reverberated through the glass windows, a mechanical heartbeat that amplified the tension in the room. All eyes darted between him and Jasmine, the waitress who had dared to do what no one else ever had, stand against his son. She felt the weight of those eyes pressing against her back, but she refused to shrink. She had already made her choice when she picked that bill off the floor and handed it back with dignity instead of submission. There was no retreat now. Richard's gaze was piercing, the kind of gaze that seemed to peel back layers of a person's soul. His steel blue eyes locked onto Jasmine, unblinking. His voice, when he spoke again, was both calm and dangerous, the tone of a man who had spent his entire life accustomed to control. "Do you realize what you've done?" he asked, his words deliberate, echoing in the hushed space. Jasmine's heart hammered in her chest, but her chin stayed lifted. "I stopped someone from harassing me. That's all." The billionaire's lips curved into a cold, humorless smile. "That someone is my son." He took another step forward, the soles of his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. "And my son is the heir to an empire you couldn't even begin to imagine." The manager, who had been hovering helplessly near the kitchen, sprang forward, nearly tripping over himself. "Mr. Carlyle, sir, I assure you this was all a misunderstanding. My waitress didn't." "Quiet!" Richard cut him off without even looking his way. The word was a whip crack, and the manager fell silent, shrinking back with a flushed face. Richard's eyes returned to Jasmine. "Tell me, young lady, what exactly gave you the courage to humiliate a Carlyle in front of all these people? Was it foolishness? Or a death wish?" The words sliced deep, but Jasmine stood her ground. "No one should be above basic respect," she said firmly. "Your son treated me like I was less than human. Money doesn't give him that right. And it doesn't give you that right either." A murmur swept through the room. Diners glanced nervously at one another, caught between fear and admiration. Many had their phones raised, recording, the red dots of cameras glowing like watchful eyes in the dim light. Richard noticed, of course. His gaze flickered briefly toward the phones before returning to Jasmine, and she wondered if his measured control was partly because he knew the world was watching. For several long moments he said nothing. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between anger and calculation. Then, to everyone's shock, he laughed. It was not the hollow laugh of his son's arrogance, but a booming, genuine sound that reverberated through the restaurant like rolling thunder. Patrons flinched, confused, some even more unsettled than when he had entered. Jasmine narrowed her eyes, unsure what game he was playing. "You're fearless," Richard said finally, amusement lacing his words. "Or maybe just too stubborn to be afraid. Either way, I can't decide if that makes you reckless or remarkable." Jasmine frowned, her voice calm but steady. "I'm not trying to be remarkable. I'm just trying to be treated like a person." Richard tilted his head slightly, studying her as though she were a puzzle. "Do you have any idea how many people grovel before me every day? How many politicians bend their morals to earn my favor? And here you are, a waitress, standing in my face as though you're my equal." His smile widened, but it wasn't cruel this time. "I haven't seen that in years." The room held its breath. No one could quite believe what they were hearing. Was the billionaire praising her? Testing her? Setting her up for an even greater humiliation? Jasmine swallowed, the weight of his words pressing heavily. Maybe no one stood up to you because they're afraid of what they'll lose. I don't have anything left to lose except my self-respect. And I'm not giving that up. Not for you, not for your son, not for anyone. Richard's laughter faded, leaving silence in its wake. He studied her for a long, quiet moment, and in that silence the storm outside cracked the sky open with a flash of lightning. His voice, when it returned, was low, almost thoughtful. My son is a fool, he said at last, the admission stunning everyone. I've spoiled him beyond redemption. He's arrogant, entitled, and weak because I allowed him to be. You embarrassed him tonight, yes, but in doing so, you revealed something he's never had to face before, someone who isn't afraid of him. The crowd shifted, whispers rising, phones still held high. Even Jasmine felt herself caught off guard by the unexpected honesty in his tone. Still, she didn't relax, not yet. What exactly are you saying? She asked cautiously. Richard's gaze sharpened again, like a blade catching the light. I'm saying you've just impressed me. And very few people impress me. Gasps filled the air. The tension twisted in a new direction, no longer fear of reprisal but confusion, disbelief. What was this man doing? The manager stumbled forward again, sweating profusely, his words tumbling out in panic. Mr. Carlyle, sir, please, if you're saying she impressed you, then perhaps we can resolve this quietly, without any. I wasn't speaking to you. Richard snapped, his eyes never leaving Jasmine's face. She crossed her arms slowly, her hands trembling though she tried to mask it. If you're expecting me to thank you for that, don't. I didn't stand up to your son for your approval. I did it because it was right. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Richard's lips. And that's exactly why you may be worth far more than you think. Every diner leaned forward, hanging on his words. Brandon, who had slipped back and through the door just as his father began speaking, froze near the entrance, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as he realized his father wasn't coming to defend him at all. His eyes darted around, desperate to reclaim control, but the room wasn't looking at him anymore. The spotlight, the attention, the power, all of it had shifted to Jasmine. Richard finally broke the silence with words that would leave the room buzzing long after the helicopter blades stopped spinning. How would you like to work for me? The restaurant erupted in gasps, whispers cascading like waves crashing against the shore. Phones shot higher, recording every detail. Some patrons even clapped their hands over their mouths in disbelief. Jasmine's own breath caught in her throat. Work for you? She repeated, unable to mask her shock. Yes, Richard said simply. Not here, not serving tables to ungrateful men like my son. I mean work for me, at Carlyle Enterprises. A place where your strength, your conviction, and your refusal to bend will be valued instead of punished. The room swirled with astonishment, the noise rising again, but Jasmine barely heard it. She stared at him, her mind racing. This was the turning point she never expected, a moment that could shatter or transform her life. She had no idea if this was a test, a trap, or a genuine opportunity, but she knew one thing for certain. The balance of power in the room had shifted completely. The room was still vibrating with the echo of Richard Carlyle's words. For a moment, no one breathed, as though the entire restaurant itself was suspended in time. A billionaire had just offered a waitress a job in front of 100 strangers, and not just any job, an opportunity that could change her entire life. The sound of the helicopter blades thumping outside seemed to punctuate the moment, each beat pressing into Jasmine's chest like a reminder that this was real, not some dream she would wake from when her alarm rang for another endless shift. She stared at him, her lips parting slightly, though no words came out at first. Around her, the crowd murmured in disbelief, recording every second. She caught glimpses of faces, some alight with admiration, others with envy, some skeptical. She even saw a young girl at the far end of the room looking at her as though she were a superhero. It made Jasmine's throat tighten, because she knew what it meant to be invisible in a world that dismissed you. For just a second, she thought of her mother, and the long years of sacrifices, of every time she herself had swallowed an insult just to get through a shift, and of how many nights she had gone home wondering if this life would ever amount to anything. Richard's presence loomed closer, his eyes never leaving her. "Yes," he repeated calmly, as if the entire room wasn't buzzing with shock. "I want you to work for me. Courage is rare. Integrity even rarer. You have both, and I don't waste opportunities when I see them." Jasmine finally found her voice, though it shook slightly. "You don't even know me. You don't know what I've been through. You saw 5 minutes of my life and think you've got me figured out?" His expression didn't falter, though his eyes softened just slightly, like steel reflecting light. "That 5 minutes told me more than most people tell me in 5 years. Every day, I sit across from men who flatter me, women who fear me, employees who would sell their souls to keep my approval. You looked me in the eye and told me I was wrong. Do you realize how rare that is?" She exhaled slowly, her body trembling with the enormity of what was happening. "And if I say no?" His answer was immediate, his tone absolute. "Then you walk out of here tonight with your head high, and nothing changes. You keep serving tables. You keep scraping by. But if you say yes, if you get on that helicopter with me, you step into a life where your voice will matter." Gasps rippled again, phones captured every syllable, and all Jasmine could hear was her own heart pounding like a drum in her ears. She saw Brandon near the door, his face twisted with disbelief and rage. His fists were clenched, his jaw rigid, but he said nothing, because even he knew this was beyond his control now. His father wasn't here to scold Jasmine. His father was here to elevate her, to offer her the one thing Brandon himself had never earned: respect. The manager stumbled forward again, wringing his hands. "Mr. Carlyle, sir, perhaps this isn't the place to discuss such serious matters. We don't want to make a scene." Richard turned slightly, his voice dropping into a cutting growl. "This already is a scene. The whole world is going to see it. Best make sure they see the right ending." Jasmine could feel the eyes of the room urging her toward an answer. But she wasn't going to let herself be swept along by the momentum of Richard's power. She steadied herself, inhaling deeply, and then said, "I'll hear you out. But I won't be someone's trophy or a pawn in a power game. If I work for you, it'll be on my terms. My dignity isn't for sale." For a long beat, Richard studied her, the faintest of smiles tugging at his lips. Then he extended his hand. "That's exactly the answer I was hoping for." A slow, cautious applause began in the back of the room. Then another, then a wave, until the entire restaurant erupted in clapping. Diners stood, some cheering, others whistling, their voices filling the air with a kind of electric energy Jasmine had never felt in her life. She glanced around, her chest tightening, overwhelmed by the sudden surge of support from strangers who only an hour ago hadn't known her name. She reached out and took Richard's hand. His grip was firm, unyielding, but respectful. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, Jasmine felt the knot of fear in her stomach loosen. She wasn't beaten. She wasn't diminished. She was being recognized, not as a servant, not as someone beneath notice, but as someone worth something. Richard gestured toward the doors, and the guards parted to clear a path. The floodlights from the helicopter spilled through the entrance, a glowing invitation. The sound of the rotors grew louder again as the engines powered up, as though the night itself was preparing to carry her away. Jasmine hesitated, her eyes flicking back to the tables where people were still recording, where she saw the little girl still staring at her like she was witnessing history. She thought again of her mother, of the sacrifices and the endless reminders to never let anyone take away who you are. She thought of all the times she had been invisible, only to discover now that the whole world was watching her. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and began walking toward the light. As she passed Brandon, she felt his eyes burning into her, full of fury and humiliation. He muttered something under his breath, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the helicopter. His father didn't even spare him a glance. To Richard Carlyle, in this moment, Brandon was background noise, a mistake he had created but no longer had patience for. The applause followed Jasmine out the doors, into the night where the storm clouds still swirled overhead. The wind from the blades whipped her hair across her face, stung her skin, but she didn't flinch. Richard stepped into the helicopter after her, the guards closing in tight, and as she climbed inside, the entire restaurant pressed against the windows to watch. The seats smelled of leather and power, the hum of the machine vibrating through her bones. Richard sat opposite her, calm and commanding, as though this was the most natural thing in the world. Through the glass, she saw the crowd below still filming, still applauding, their faces turned upward toward her, as if she had already become something larger than herself. As the helicopter lifted from the ground, the restaurant grew smaller, the people below shrinking into dots, the world stretching wide and unknown ahead of her. Jasmine pressed her palms against her knees, steadying herself. She didn't know what awaited her, what challenges would come with accepting a place in the Carlyle Empire. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she had refused to be broken. The city lights glittered beneath them as the helicopter soared into the stormy sky. Jasmine glanced at Richard, who was watching her with the faintest expression of satisfaction. He had power, wealth, everything that most people bent under, and yet what had impressed him tonight wasn't money, it was her refusal to bow. She turned her gaze to the window, to the endless horizon beyond. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like the world was closing in. She felt it opening wide, stretching out with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the roar of the helicopter, beneath the storm and the applause, Jasmine smiled. Because she had proven a truth no amount of wealth could erase.